So somebody shared with me recently that the 12 steps can be divided into 4 parts. The first part is about giving up. I don't like that word, but surrender, giving up. The second part is about owning up. The third is about making up. And the fourth is about keeping up. If the 12 steps were a football game, we would find ourselves right now in this series at the end of the third quarter, beginning the fourth quarter, that time when the body is broken and bruised and battered and we're tired and our minds are beginning to wonder, do I have it in me to keep doing this? The temptation is to lose heart and to stop competing. Maybe you've been in that situation on the sports field or somewhere else in your life. It's a hard place to be. But the 12 steps aren't a football game. They're not a game at all. And if we want to use sports metaphors, they're more a marathon than they are a sprint. We're never done with recovery. We're never done with the journey towards healing and wholeness. It requires intention and discipline and hard work over our lifetime. So today I want to explore steps 9 and 10, and I want to do so in light of the parable that Penny and I just shared with you. The parable of the loving or waiting father. Now, I'm not going to talk about the parable much of the sermon, but I promise you I'll come back around to it, and I want you, as you're listening to these 2 steps, to think about that image of the waiting and loving father, because it is central to everything that I want to say today. But before we turn to step 9, if you were here last week, and if you weren't, I encourage you to find it online. Steps 7 and 8, as Penny reflected on last week, are already really rigorous. We humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings, and we made a list of all the people we've harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. This is the spade work for the work of step 9, where we make direct amends to that list of people, all those people that we've harmed, wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Now, this step is more than just shooting a text to someone we may have hurt or writing a letter or sending an email, all of which can be really important steps. It's more than picking up the phone call or the phone and making a phone call. It's really at its heart about face-to-face encounter. It's about looking at somebody in the eye and having the humility and the courage to ask for forgiveness and to apologize. To say, I'm sorry. I'd like to make amends with you. What can I do to make it right? It's that difficult. And it's that simple. It's learning to ask for an apology, or to apologize and ask for forgiveness, and then to shut up and listen and wait. It's about sincere apologies. It's about honest attempts at restoration and reconciliation, whether or not those attempts are well received. It's about opening the door from our side and keeping it open unless and until we decide to close it again. Which brings us to the second part of that step 9, which is so intriguing, such a beautiful nuance, and leads us to kind of a complexity in our discernment process, except when to do so would injure them or others. What could this possibly mean? I remember as a child, I learned that honesty is the best policy. Maybe you learned that as well. And for the most part, that's pretty good advice until it isn't. Until it isn't. One of my mentors used to say, Marc, total honesty is brutality. Total honesty is brutality. And that was before all of the full disclosure on social media and on the internet and on all of our news channels. Imagine what he would say today. Pure honesty is violence, especially when what we're sharing isn't helpful and in fact is harmful, or when we are sharing things that people don't have the right to know, or we're sharing with things, truths that people can't handle in a responsible way. Step 9 encourages us to ask prayerful, discerning, important questions, such as, what does she really need to hear? Or what does he have the right to hear? Now, we live in an media-hyped age where the line between news and gossip is increasingly blurred, and the latest gossip is presented as, quote, breaking news on our 24-hour news channels, giving it a legitimacy it doesn't deserve. And our wanting to know is devolving into our needing to know. I must know what's going on in everybody's life. But gossip isn't a human right. It's actually an obstacle to human relationships. And it is an obstacle towards living into the spiritual wisdom that Paul and others want to impart to us. If you read the first chapter of Romans, you'll see all of the hot sins out there in the open that Paul lays out. Here are some of them: God haters, wicked people, evil, covetous people, slanderers, murderers. Included on that list, gossipers. Gossipers. And yet we've mainstreamed it. It's become part of the news to gossip. But many wise people caution us against gossip. There's a wonderful story in the Jewish tradition that illustrates the evil of gossiping. A woman is gossiping about her neighbor to the community, telling a story about something that has happened, and it gets through the community, and finally it even gets back to the lady that she's talking about. And the lady she's talking about is devastated. And then the next day, the woman discovers that the story wasn't true. It never happened. And so the woman who told the gossip is devastated. And she feels horrible. And so she goes to her rabbi and she asks him what she should do. What can I do to make this right? And the rabbi said, go home and get yourself a feather pillow and bring it back to me. So she does. She thinks it's kind of strange. And so she brings the feather pillow back, and the rabbi says, now open the pillow and pull out all the feathers, which she does. And after a few minutes, he says, now I want you to go and find every one of those feathers and put them back into the pillow. And she says, that's impossible. They've fallen all over this room, and the window's open, and they've blown outside, and they're all over the place. How can I possibly find all those pillows or those feathers? And he said, that's what happens when we gossip. When we tell a story that isn't true about somebody else, or even if it is true, these words fly just like the feathers flew in the wind, and once we say them, we can't take them back. Truth-telling has to be more than simply the facts, ma'am. Like laying out the facts as if that's enough, just giving people information. That's not truth-telling. It must include discernment and consideration about what others have the right to know and what they can handle responsibly. If you're not a doctor, you don't have the right to know somebody's medical history or their pre-existing conditions. You don't have a right to know somebody's sexual orientation. You don't have a right to know whether somebody's in a 12-step group. That's why they're called anonymous groups. There are certain information that we don't have a right to know. And if we do know it, we ought to handle it with grace and discernment. Even our government understands this. There is the Fifth Amendment, which protects us from incriminating ourselves. That principle is understood in many places in our society. Richard Rohr says that not having the right to know everything is a moral principle that our culture would be wise to learn or to relearn. The truth is, full disclosure is being weaponized by angry politicians, tabloid journalists, opportunistic corporations, and toxic people every day. Too often, the people that we convict in the court of public opinion, if they're not falsely convicted, don't even get a trial before we jump all over them. And that destroys their life. It destroys everybody who's connected to them, including their family, and we don't take adequate consideration of all that. Step 9 is about both making amends and keeping us from wounding each other any further. While step 10 keeps the real work in front of us, the ongoing work of self-awareness and making amends. It's interesting and worth noting that step 10 is the first step to be repeated in the 12 steps, highlighting its centrality and its importance in the ongoing work of recovery. The truth is, are we ever done looking honestly at ourselves? We ought not to be. The truth is, are we ever above having to apologize every single day of our lives for the way that we treat people or talk to them? Step 10, which is we continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, we properly admitted it. Now, it's not just about moral self-evaluation. I would argue it's about contemplative living. And what does that mean? It means the ability and cultivating the ability to see ourselves calmly, objectively, and compassionately. To recognize ourselves for who we really are and to look at ourselves through the loving gaze of God, who is not harshly punitive with us, but sees us in all of our flaws and all of our brokenness. And to learn as God mirrors to us how to look at ourselves without harsh judgment and without shying away from the responsibility that we all have to take. It's learning to look at ourselves and say, oh my God, there I go again. And then not spending the next week beating ourselves up for what we saw, calmly, objectively, compassionately seeing ourselves, being able to observe ourselves even as we're interacting with other people. That's the best antidote to addiction, because what addiction does is it thrives on denial and pretense, it thrives on secrecy, and ultimately it thrives on shame and feeling ashamed about who we are at our core. And so this is ultimately, even though it may not feel like that on the surface, this is compassionate work to be able to see ourselves as we really are. And here's the deal, we can't truly see others for who they are without seeing ourselves first. We can't really love another human being as well as we ought to if we don't look at ourselves as we really are. That's why Jesus' command to love our enemies isn't just brilliant moral teaching. It's actually good and healthy psychology. Because our enemies bring us face to face with all the things we don't want to see about ourselves. You can be sure of it. The person that frustrates you is just giving yourself back to you. And until you can see that, you're going to keep making him the problem or her the problem, when the problem is you and me. Love your enemies is good psychology. There's a reason that every week we say forgiven and forgiving people. That's the right order. It begins with an experience of forgiveness and then flows into the capacity and growing ability to forgive others. Until we are aware of our own need for forgiveness, our forgiveness is often really shallow and often self-serving. And the moment we realize the enemy isn't them, but us, and then we stay with that insight without resorting to harsh judgment of ourselves, something can begin to shift in our lives. And we can forgive other people better, warts and all, because we know what it's like to be loved and forgiven, warts and all. Pastor Cameron Trimble borrowed an image recently from the Czech novelist Milan Kundera on the unbearable lightness of being. And in the book, Kundera uses the word kitsch to talk about the, quote, pretend world that we're incentivized and encouraged to create online and in our lives. And instead of using kitsch to describe something that is overly sentimental or garish or poor taste, Kundera uses kitsch in a more broader and memorable and quite honestly smelly way. She says it's the absolute denial of our poop. The absolute denial that our poop stinks, each of us. And it's the absolute denial that our culture stinks, and our tribe stinks, and our nation stinks. And she says this is the work of our time. This is the work of our time, to acknowledge the ugly, smelly parts of ourselves and our tribe and our culture and our nation and our world. But too often when we're challenged and confronted with the ugliness, what we do is we try to deny it or cover it up or pretend it isn't there. We whitewash the reality of our brokenness so that we can maintain, at least in our own mind, everybody else smells the poop a mile away, but for ourselves, what we do is we whitewash it and we maintain this illusion of purity and wholeness for ourselves or our tribe or our culture or our nation. But Trimble argues if we are to be brave and humble, we got to let go of the pretend world. We got to let it go. And we must become aware and own our poop, the ugly part of ourselves, the ugly part of our tribe, of our culture, of our nation, which is there and present. Everybody else usually sees it before we do, but we have to learn to see it ourselves. And why do we have to do this? Why is she so insistent that we must do this work? Because there is no evolutionary path forward. There is no healing. There is no wholeness. There is no restoration and reconciliation without this kind of honesty. And all of our relationships and the health of our culture, the health of our nation, the health of our planet depends upon our willingness to face our poop, to own it, acknowledge it. She writes, we're in a time of humble reckoning where covering up our mess only makes it stink more. Now, this may seem to you like an overstatement, but let me suggest that maybe that's the elder son part of you, the elder son part of me. Remember who Jesus gets angry with. It's not the sinners. It's not the people making a mess of their lives. He doesn't get angry with them. It's the people who are making a mess of their lives and they don't even see it. The people whose poop stinks and everybody else sees it, but they don't. That's who he gets angry with. It's important to remember that the scribes and the Pharisees, that's us. And it's important to remember that they are good, decent people. They really are. They are the kinds of people who show up in church when many people aren't. They're the people giving percentage, sometimes a tithe of their income to the church or to the mission of Jesus Christ or some mission. These are the kinds of people who are sincerely trying to make a difference in the world. These are good people, but listen to what Jesus says to us. Calling out our hypocrisy, our stage acting. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but on the inside are full of all kinds of filth. He really said that about us. These words sound punitive, and in some extent they are, but they are an invitation for us to become more self-aware, to be able to recognize, as the men on the men's retreat were invited to do this past weekend, to recognize our shadow, to recognize our poop, those things that we don't want to acknowledge about ourselves that are present in our lives. They're part of our humanity. And the only way to stop projecting it on everybody else and seeing it everywhere else but in ourselves is to bring it into the light of our awareness, our consciousness, to bring it into the light of day. That's what it means to take the log out of our own eye, so that we can see fit, so that we can be faithful to take the speck out of other people's eyes. That's where the 12th step is leading us. And that's why I think they're so relevant for the moment we find ourselves in. Because in the end, God doesn't seem to be primarily concerned with moral perfection. No, he doesn't. Jesus doesn't. What God seems more concerned with is that we are real and honest about who we are. that we are honest about our shadow, our imperfection, our brokenness, our need for redemption, our need for reconciliation, our need for restoration. And when we're real enough to tell the truth and work towards change, Jesus knows that that will inevitably lead us into the loving and merciful arms of God. That's why he's so persistent that we see it. Not so that we get stuck there, no. So that we can be embraced in our place of vulnerability and brokenness. Which brings us back to the parable of the prodigal son, or the parable of the loving, waiting father. How is this father able to love both sons so well? Not only the wild, impetuous, licentious prodigal son, but the tight, rigid, juiceless elder son. He loves them both perfectly and completely. How is he able to do it? Here's my suspicion. Because he knows these parts of himself. He understands the temptation that the prodigal son gave into, and he knows the temptation that the elder son has fallen into, and he has come to terms with those parts of himself, and he has discovered, probably the hard way, that he's more than that. And he has been on the receiving end of forgiveness. And he has discovered for himself that the only thing powerful enough to change anything and anyone is love. Sorry. Love. Not punitiveness, not harshness, not judgment, not telling them what they need to hear. No, love. Not setting them right. Love. Not sticking them in jail for the rest of their life. Love. Not one-upping them with an argument. No, love. Each time, every time, if we're serious about changing people for the better, the only thing that works. History will teach us this if we pay attention, is love. And so this man ran to welcome the prodigal home without shame, and he gave the elder son some loving wisdom to chew on. And while we don't know the end of the story, as we don't know the end of our stories, this father did what a good teacher, a good mentor, a good rabbi does. He opened the door for his sons to learn how to be forgiven, which is the only way to learn how to be forgiving. Amen.